Next, on Investigative Report. Falsely accused. For some men, doing the right thing can land them time in jail. A friendly date can end with an arrest on a false charge of rape. Being there for one's children can be rewarded by a false accusation of child molestation. And for participating in an argument where your partner, not you, was the aggressor, can end up getting you arrested, fired from work, and branded a wife beater for the rest of one's life. Today, it would appear as if the presumption of innocence in law has been replaced by the presumption of guilt. Now, this is in cases where men are accused by their female counterparts. We now live in an environment where false allegations of sexual abuse or sexual harassment, child abuse, or child molestation charges carry the same weight and the same penalties of incarceration as if they were actually true. Historically, in a traditional court setting, the presumption of innocence was a man's best defense. But many of these false cases, which involve family acquaintances, are not tried in traditional courts. Typically, men are run through the ringer of the family court system where the odds are highly stacked against them long before the trial date has even been set. In these kangaroo courts, men are historically considered guilty on a woman's say-so until he can successfully convince the judge, the jury, and the news media otherwise. But usually by then, the damage has been done. Even in the regular court system where justice is said to be blind, men cannot hope to get their fair shake against such heinous and unfounded accusations. Most men we spoke with in formulating this series claim that the modern day court system has been redesigned as a means of profit for all parties except for the accused. Even if these men are ultimately judged as innocent on the other side of a false accusation, they will emerge from the system as broken men, bitter men, and men with publicly tarnished reputations. Although these men's false allegations may have been made the lead story on the nightly news or front page of their hometown newspaper, there is no guarantee that these stories will be recanted with such zeal. It would seem as if the public is not as interested in a man's innocence as they are in the sensationalism of his guilt, or the stuff of what dime novels are written about. As the team put together this segment, we found numerous stories of men who were wrongly accused. Stories of men not being believed, of being abandoned by their friends, family members, and their employer. We even found two gentlemen that sat on death row for 42 years under false allegations from one woman until they were exonerated in 2019. Now, a study completed just last year noted that over 20 million American men have been falsely accused of abuse. The survey conducted by YouGov revealed that 8% of Americans report being falsely accused of domestic violence, child abuse, sexual assault, or other forms of abuse. The 2,407 survey respondents were representative of the U.S. adult population. The 8% figure represents 20.4 million adults. In 62% of those cases, the false accusations were reported to be by females. Often the false allegation was made in the context of child custody dispute cases in order to win. Most of these men asked the question, why don't these women who falsely accused them get the prison time that they were headed for, which would make sense, right? You see, in just about any other type of legal case, it is punishable by law to falsely accuse someone of a crime that they did not commit and walk away scot-free. You just can't do it. But in the cases where women falsely accuse men, this is exactly what happens. I give you now the names of the first 9 people of our monthly series entitled Falsely Accused. Our first case comes from an honest boy, now man, who was falsely accused of kidnapping and rape of his female classmate. At the time, he was a standout high school football student at Polytechnic High School in Long Beach, California. Because of the way he excelled on the football team, major national recruiters were watching him with promises towards the NFL on the sidelines. Because of his diligent effort, he had recently received a verbal promise for a full scholarship to the University of Southern California. Now, in fact, Everything was coming up roses for this young man, and there was no way he could seem to fail. That is until one fateful day when the young Mr. Banks, who would have his life turned upside down by being falsely accused of kidnapping and rape by a fellow female student who was a close friend in the year 2002. That day, both Mr. Banks and his female classmates' relationship went from platonic to amorous as they decided to duck out under a set of stairs to kiss. Now, the most they did was kiss and fondle one another. No clothing came off, and no penetration occurred during the brief romantic moment. But later that same afternoon, the police rushed into Brian's mother's house to arrest him for rape and kidnapping of that same young lady. Because of these accusations, Brian was subsequently kicked off of the football team, expelled from school, and his promising scholarship to the University of Southern California revoked immediately. This is a young man. But knowing he was innocent, Mr. Banks consented to a DNA test that would either confirm or refute the rape. Now, I ask you, what rapist would do this? Eventually, the DNA test came back. Those tests revealed that Mr. Brian Banks was negative for rape, but he was still placed on trial for rape. At that time, just prior to trial, his female attorney, knowing how the laws were skewed against men, believed that he would not get a fair trial. She based this upon his height. She based this upon his build and weight, and finally upon his color as a black man. She would recommend to the young Mr. Banks that he take a plea deal from the state. Is that the best a lawyer could do? She told him as part of the plea deal that he would either face 18 months to 5 years in jail or 41 years in prison without that deal. So although he knew he was innocent, Mr. Banks accepted the plea deal and spent the next 5 years in jail. During his time in incarceration, the family of his accuser, Miss Juanetta Gibson, sued the school district and won a settlement of $1.5 million for the school not having a safe environment enough to protect that young lady. This environment, in her lawyer's estimation, is what contributed to her being raped. After Mr. Banks honestly served his time in jail, he was released and an additional 5 years of ankle monitoring tracking added on to his sentence. He also had to register as a sex offender for the rest of his natural life. He had to keep away from public schools, public parks, and public beaches during the daylight hours where children would frequent. Mr. Banks was seen in the eyes of the law as a predator of the vulnerable. A predator, although the entire incident was completely fabricated against him. Now, one day Mr. Banks decided to fight for himself and petitioned an organization known as the Innocence Project to aid him in getting his conviction overturned. Around that time, he set up his first Facebook page. And who would you guess would be the first person to attempt to friend him? If you said the same girl that accused him of rape, you would be absolutely right. You see, although he wanted nothing to do with her, he allowed a meeting after setting up a sting operation with a private detective to prove his innocence. The detective and Mr. Banks wanted Miss Gibson to on camera say that the kidnapping and rape never occurred. When Miss Gibson came to meet Mr. Banks, now age 22, at that particular office of the investigator, they got her to say she was never kidnapped nor raped. She also confessed that she never had sex up to that point, nor thereafter in youth. She said she wanted to help the men prove Mr. Banks' innocence, but that she did not want to give back the $1.5 million, as this was a lot of money. But long story short, the DA's office agreed to hear the tape confession and ended up suggesting to the judge that Mr. Banks be exonerated. But in less than 14 days of that exoneration, the NFL came calling to offer Mr. Banks the spot on a team he had missed out over 9 years earlier. Mr. Banks ultimately accepted training with the Atlanta Falcons. Today, Mr. Banks is a motivational speaker, author, and he has a movie coming out this August entitled Brian Banks. Now, but all of the cases don't end up as sweetly as the accused in the false rape of domestic charges of Mr. Banks. Some men are sentenced for life and others end up fighting for custodial time of their own children. Take this next case, for example. Mr. Darcy Bolton. Now, Mr. Darcy Bolton, a man who was falsely accused by his wife of assault and criminal harassment. Mrs. Bolton filed these false charges as a way of getting even with Mr. Bolton, who initially wanted her evicted from the home because he felt that she developed a drug habit that would be detrimental for their children's upbringing. Now, in fact, he went to the police station to report this problem a few days prior to her fabricating the abuse claim. When his wife was under the influence, she did not take time to do the things a wife or mother normally would. One report from his child's school indicated that his wife went 5 days without combing their daughter's hair. He did not find out this note directly from his wife, but in the house when he was able to return there. His wife, feeling that she would lose custody of her children, devised a plan of abuse to reverse his plan of getting her out of the house. Now, Mr. Bolden explained in an interview that his wife took off on him one day with the children after they had an argument. After that time, he had not seen her or the children for 4 or 5 days, so he involved the police department. The police told him to stay at home and they would come there shortly to take a statement. Once the police arrived at the house, they asked him, "Are you Darcy Bolden?" He replied, "Yes, I am." To that they said, "Then you are under arrest." He was confused and thought, this is wrong, something's not right. Mr. Bolden had been to the same police station days before complaining of drug use by his wife. He was arrested and placed in jail for 24 hours on the false charges filed of assault and criminal harassment. His wife not only filed false charges against him, but she had also taken out an EPO, or what is known as an emergency protective order, against him. Because of this, Mr. Bolden was barred from contacting his wife or his children. In fact, it would be an additional 269 days before he was allowed to see his children again. And that meeting, ladies and gentlemen, was only through a Skype-type communication set up by the court system. Now, on his part, Mr. Bolden continued to make the mortgage payments on a house that he was restricted from going to. But his ex-wife's boyfriend was not, and could live there for free. The part of the story that really didn't make sense to me was him paying the mortgage on a home his children no longer lived at because they were in the care of their grandparents. So at one point, at feeling overwhelmed in the fight to see his children, and a lot of guys do, Mr. Bolden was advised that it would be best to retain a family lawyer to expedite his case in addition to a criminal lawyer to fight the charges against him. But the family lawyer would cost $30,000. And if you have ever been through any of these cases before, you know that the court system and a trial is basically about $30,000, whether it's divorce or child custody. Now, he could not afford a criminal attorney and a family attorney at the same time. So Mr. Bolden indicated in his statement something that I've heard many men say in this situation. And that is that the legal system is a racket to get money from the people that are drugged through it. Just that, just a racket. He, like so many men, felt alone as they were going through the darkest days of their life, until a friend or a family member stepped forward to tell them that everything was going to be all right. You see, once a man has been labeled an abuser fictitiously or otherwise, he is typically abandoned by everyone around him as if he was a danger. Now, this abandonment cuts deep to the soul of men who are most likely already alienated from their friends and family by marrying these particular women. Many of these women have no problem requesting their men either choose between their family and friends or them. It's either them or me, they tell them. So that when these women take off on these men and abandon them, they have no one. Some guys in a situation don't see a reason for sticking around, and others end up taking their own lives without that needed critical support. Now, Mr. Bolden admits that he felt that way until a friend called him and noticed that he seemed down. He admits that he prepared a .22 rifle in his home to take his own life. Had it not been for that friend, he would have. Once he found himself again, he decided to turn from being a victim to a man that wanted to fight for his rights. Because of that fight in him, he is now able to see his children and have meals with them at the house instead of just taking them out in public to eat. But you don't have to be a married man like Mr. Bolden or have children to have someone make a false accusation against you. Our next story gives a classic example of that. In our next falsely accused case involves Mr. Mike Tennyson. Mike Tennyson became a victim of the Me Too movement and the cancel culture at large. Mike Tennyson has become the latest writer to go public with details of life among the canceled. Now, in a newly published essay, the ex-Washington Post journalist turned restaurant janitor, after being fired, explains what it's like to go through the Me Too false accusation meat grinder and come out the other side with a career reduced to tiny shards. Mr. Tennyson describes in an article how his friends and colleagues completely abandoned him. He speaks sadly about how he was unable to earn an income in his field. All thanks to the writer Maria Donegan's Shitty Men and Media List. The list, a crowdsourced database that became a forum for anonymous, unproven allegations in the year 2017. Now, almost immediately after its release, a close friend of 10 years cut Mike off and hasn't spoken to him since, even after he reached out to talk to him. Day after day, Mike tells how he was tortured by the thought that even more people would learn of the allegations on that list, or that he would be unexpectedly attacked for the accusations online. He says that too often he was found himself hanging out with friends as the discussion turned to celebrities being Me Too'd and been incapable of revealing that this also happened to him. Now, sooner or later he had feared they'll know too. It's been more than a year since Mike had dated a woman. Working 3 low-paying jobs at the same time means he's always busy and broke. Plus, any woman who does the usual pre-date research online could stumble upon the list with the false accusations against him. How could he explain away in the early stages of a relationship? Tennyson wasn't famous, although he worked at the Washington Post and had a book published by HarperCollins. Now, which made things worse. Though he was sufficiently well known to be targeted with false allegations, having written that major publication and contributed to Deadspin.com, he wasn't one of those well-connected intellectual celebrities who could call on a career-saving support from powerful allies. Couldn't do what Clinton did. Now, his story is noteworthy, writes Tennyson, only because he's one of the least powerful men to have ever been publicly accused in the Me Too era. What makes this event intolerable isn't just that the allegations against him are false. It's that he has no idea who made them in the first place. Lately, Tennyson has come upon especially difficult times. Working as a janitor and canvasser hasn't left him enough money to get the inspection tags on his car renewed. When he was pulled over and ticketed recently, Tennyson took a Twitter for help. That's when Mr. Stephen Elliott, a man who knows exactly what Tennyson is going through, decided to raise funds for him with a GoFundMe page, which as of this video raised almost $4,000. Now, having been included on Donegan's Shitty Media Men list also, Mr. Elliott decided to sue Donegan for the defamation of character for $1.5 million. The case is still pending in court system this year, but things look promising for the accused. Now, our next case proves that men accused of these false allegations are usually blindsided once they're arrested, booked, and processed through the system they never knew prior to waking up that morning. Now, Jason Pohl talks about a woman who fabricated an elaborate hoax about being kidnapped and raped at Knight Point by Mr. Dunstan Toth. Mr. Dunstan Toth was Winston National Guardsman. Now, force reporters accused her, she didn't know this was going to backfire in her face. So she ended up being handcuffed and taken to jail in Colorado. Miss Catherine Bennett, 21 years of age at the time, was sentenced to 32 days in the Weld County Jail and 180 days of electronic home monitoring and 5 years of supervised probation during a hearing that included an emotional statement by the man whose life she falsely accused. Now, Bennett's parents also told the judge that their daughter is unexpectedly pregnant by her fiance's baby, something she probably devised to prevent from going to jail. Now, the Fort Collins woman told police in November that Dunstan Toth, then 25 years of age, had kidnapped her from the Windsor Safeway parking lot and drugged her and raped her at Knight Point at his nearby home before, ladies and gentlemen, she was able to run out of the house to freedom. Now, Toth was arrested, but the case against him was quickly dropped once police discovered that Bennett had fabricated the entire story. As a result of the false report, Toth lost his job at the OtterBox, his place of employment, and was barred from deploying with his Army National Guard team to Cuba. Even after his exoneration of guilt, he has since struggled to find work, been denied on multiple apartment applications, and has become prone to anxiety attacks. In the court, Mr. Toth told the judge that his accuser's actions had made it all the more difficult for the real-life abusers to come forward. He continued on by saying that this is unacceptable. No woman should have to live in fear of wrongful judgment because others have abused the system like she did. He said, "I beg that you do not allow this woman to shame the name of other women," he added. Now, Bennett's arrest affidavit highlights several instances in which she changed her story and made her claims that police later found to be completely untrue. So Fort Collins authorities arrested her December 10th on a warrant out of Windsor. She remained out on jail on bond and was staying with her family in Illinois for the most of the year. A jury in August found Bennett guilty of lying to police and 2 counts of tampering with physical evidence, which are all felonies. Bennett's mother and father on Friday pleaded to the judge to impose a light sentence so their daughter could continue to see an Illinois psychiatrist for treatment of several mental health conditions, including depression, obsessive compulsive disorder, and post-traumatic stress disorder. I imagine if you accuse somebody, you're going to have that. Now, Bennett did not speak during the hearing. Her parents and private attorneys said that although her conditions and complications from medications were not an excuse for a false report, they were contributing factors. They pleaded to the judge to consider her lack of prior criminal history and a decision that were not fully informed as part of a broader picture, one made completed by the revelation that she is unexpectedly pregnant. No excuse. Now, Weld County District Judge Timothy Kearns, however, considered the extremely unique situation worthy of a strong but appropriate sentence that included jail time. Bennett faced prison time, but Kearns said the Department of Corrections would not adequately address her numerous mental health concerns. Simultaneously, the judge sided with Mr. Toth by telling him, "You have been a victim, sir." He sympathized with the setbacks and lack of follow-up media coverage since his name was cleared. He says, "You are unequivocally a very good person," he added. Though Toth had been able to find work as a security company job and is now living in Fort Collins, his irreparable harm has been done to him by both psychologically and professionally. Now, don't fool yourself. Not for 1 minute. False accusations of sexual assault and rape don't just affect the male victim. They also affect the female victim who actually gets raped in life, not ones who are pretending. But it would seem that these easy cry of rape and child molestations would appear to come from stronger from those who have never had the experience of those crimes occurring with them. Take our next 2 cases. The first in which a woman who was charged for falsely accusing her boyfriend of molesting her young daughter. Now, in Rowan County, the sheriff's office arrested Miss Lori Ferguson to patrol deputies that her boyfriend sexually molested her daughter. Deputies say she claimed that she walked in on her boyfriend molesting the child as he was changing her diaper. The case was assigned to the Criminal Investigation Division, and she again reported to detectives that her boyfriend was caught molesting the child. Now, was this true? It was completely false. During the investigation, officials found that no sexual assault occurred, and Ferguson later confessed to investigators that she made the accusation up as a form of retaliation against her boyfriend for making her what? For making her mad. Is this retaliation? Ferguson was charged with filing a false police report on July the 12th and is being held in Rowan County Jail under $5,000 secured bond. Now, our next case sounds similarly the same and comes to us from Siloam Springs, Benton County, Arkansas. Now, see if you can stomach this one. Where a woman tried to incriminate her husband with a fabricated child porn, child rape, and domestic violence. So 3 different charges. And they were all fictitious, all made up. Now, luckily for her husband, it is she who landed in the sex offender registry list. Now, back in June 24, 2017, Sherry Renee Bolton went to the police and reported that her husband attacked her when she caught him raping her 13-month-old daughter. Now, Sherry showed officers vague bruises on her ribs that she say her husband did. But investigators were unable to positively identify these. She also accused her husband of child porn possession. Now, remember, child porn possession also. And presented officers with 3 images of child pornography on a phone which she claimed was her husband's. So she brought the phone forward and said, "This is my husband. He did these pictures." Now, this is odd. You see, officers questioned Sherry. Why didn't she come forward early about this? Because it happened a time apart. Now, according to police officers, Sherry Bolton said she waited to make a report because she feared retaliation from her husband. Sherry's husband and 13-month-old girl were separately questioned by police, but denied that any sexual abuse occurred. It never happened. Another lie. Her husband was also able to prove that he did not lose a phone. He had his own phone. So the phone that Sherry presented to the authorities did not belong to him whatsoever. She purchased the phone herself. It was a burner phone. Now, during the investigation, though, it was discovered that Sherry Bolton's husband had kicked her out of the home on May 22nd, 2017, while the metadata on the photos extracted from the phone that she had indicated they were downloaded by Sherry Bolton herself on May 23rd, 2017, the very next day. Now, this was 1 day later when she was outside of the home and the phone was in her possession, not his. On December 22nd that year, when she confronted with the findings, Sherry Bolton initially claimed she had no idea how the images got on the phone. But after further questioning, she finally admitted she downloaded them because she was what? Once again, she said an excuse. She said she was high on meth and in the middle of a manic episode, and she was upset at her husband. So all these cases come where they're upset with somebody. When you get upset with somebody, what do? Accuse them of murder? So Sherry Bolton said after being kicked out of the house, she went to a motel in West Salem Springs, Oklahoma, where she did meth with a man who responded to her Craigslist ad. She said that the man also kicked her out of the motel room after an argument she had with him. Sherry must have downloaded the child porn images while she was at the motel, but said she couldn't be sure. So on January 22nd, 2018, 33-year-old Sherry Renee Bolton was arrested and charged with one felony count of possessing child pornography. So she actually did it to herself. And one felony count of filing a false police report. She was freed on a $75,000 bond pending a court hearing. Now, with all shreds of evidence and her own confession pointing at her premeditated evil, Sherry Bolton still denied allegations that she tried to frame her husband with child pornography and a false police report that he raped a 13-month-old girl. However, she eventually cut a deal to avoid possible 10-year maximum prison sentence on the child pornography charge. And on June 25th, 2019, in Benton County Circuit Court, 34-year-old Sherry Bolton had eventually pleaded guilty, got sentenced to 6 years supervised probation, $2,000 fine, and restitution, and she was ordered to register as a sex offender of children. Now, beyond some mothers using their own children as weapons against their husband, there are those women that use them as pawns in custody battles and the like. Take our next case where one woman lied about child abuse in her divorce case in order to gain custody. Our story begins in Belfast, where a high court judge concluded that a woman involved in a divorce case falsely accused her husband of sexually abusing their children. In his judgment, Justice Weir said the woman's lurid and extreme allegations were so incredible and inconsistent that he initially thought she was suffering from some form of paranoid delusion. However, he concluded that she was merely motivated by spite. The woman was referred to as MJ eventually withdrew the allegations after the judge warned her the consequences of lying under oath. Details of the case, which was concluded in June, have been published by the court service. The couple split up in two different directions and each moved from the house they lived together about 80 miles apart. The children continued to see their father on one weekend a month while they stayed over their parents' house. Now, that arrangement broke down one summer in an argument over a birthday party. Much later, his ex-wife would assert that the true reason for her refusal to continue with the arrangement was that she had found evidence of sexual abuse. However, the judge found that her claims were inconsistent, contradictory, and mendacious. The judge also found that when the couple's 5-year-old daughter, referred to as T, did make allegations of improper behavior against her father, it was at the prompting of her own mother and the coaching. So a report by a child care services, which was heard in evidence, noted that the woman was obviously disappointed that her daughter, T, did not disclose anything sexual of the conversation in the interview. The court also heard that the woman prevented T from going on a school trip to Panama last Christmas because she said she was concerned that her husband would kidnap the girl. The judge said that this was an entirely bogus explanation and that the factualist decision was made only to bolster her claims against her ex-husband. Now, regardless of the consequences for her child, she didn't care. The children continue to live with their mother, and contact order has been agreed, which will allow the father at the same time, the same 1 week in a month. Justice Weir added that, on one view, it might be thought that there was no need for him to deliver a judgment, as the woman had withdrawn her claims. However, he said he was sufficiently concerned about the woman's presentation to the matter set down in the record. He also ordered that the copies of his judgment should be provided to social services and kept in their files. But all cases of false accusation don't involve sexual abuse or claims of false allegations of just anything. Our next case involves two men who were falsely accused of murder by a woman and ultimately sentenced to the death penalty, but they were innocent. These two men would end up spending 42 years in prison until a state team similar to the Innocence Project, called the Conviction Integrity Unit, would come calling to review their case. These men represent just two of the 165 men that have had their cases on death row thrown out, convictions overturned due to false allegations. Their names: Clifford Williams Jr. of Florida, who was convicted back in 1976 and finally had his charges dismissed in the year 2019. 42 years after he and his nephew were wrongfully accused of murder in Florida, and he was sentenced to death. Clifford Williams Jr. had been exonerated, submitting a report to the Conviction Unit and the Conviction Integrity Unit that found no credible evidence of guilt and credible evidence of innocence. So they said he was innocent. The Duval County prosecutors asked the Jacksonville trial court to dismiss all charges against Williams, now 76 years old, and his nephew, Nathan Myers, now 61. Now, as I said before, Williams is the 165th former death row prisoner to be exonerated in the United States since 1973. Williams and Myers were tried and convicted in 1976 for the murder of Jeanette Williams and the wounding of her girlfriend, Nina Marshall. Now, Marshall told police that the two men had entered their bedroom at night and fired shots from the foot of the bed. She identified Williams and Myers as the shooters. However, the physical evidence never presented by the defense counsel at trial revealed that the bullets had been fired from the outside through the bedroom window and had come from a single gun. Defense counsel also ignored 40 alibi witnesses whom Williams and Myers had indicated would be able to testify that they had been next door at a party the whole time. The defense presented no witnesses at the trial. The first trial resulted in a mistrial. In the second trial, which lasted 2 days only, prosecutors argued without presenting any supporting evidence that the men committed the murder because Jeanette Williams supposedly owed them a $50 drug debt. The jury convicted Williams and Myers but recommended that they be sentenced to life. But here's what went wrong. Judge Cliff Shepard, a notoriously harsh trial judge, overrode the jury's sentencing recommendation for Williams and sentenced him to death. Shepard accepted the life recommendation for 18-year-old Myers. Now, prosecutors began reinvestigating the case after newly elected state attorney Melissa Nelson created the first Conviction Integrity Unit in the state in 2018. The unit issued its report authored by the Conviction Integrity Review Director. Now, the report noted that no physical evidence linked to Williams or Myers to the shooting and that the physical evidence and scientific evidence actually contradicts Marshall's testimony about what happened. The report also found that another man, Nathaniel Lawson, had confessed to several people that he had committed the killing, and that a 1976 police report noted his presence near the crime scene around the time of the murder. Now, Thibodeau concluded that the culmination of all the evidence, most of which the jury never heard or saw, leaves no abiding confidence in the conviction of the guilt of the defendants. Williams had been trying unsuccessfully for years to get anyone interested in the case and responded emotionally after the hearing by saying, "My mother died while I was on death row, and I just wanted to get out and see my kids. There wasn't nobody but them," he said. Our last two cases come to us from viewers of the Men's Channel. And if you have a story in the future, send it to us. We'll talk about it on this episode. He gives us a case where his ex-wife and he first got together. She had a very small business, he said. He offered to help her expand it, and the offer she jumped on, of course. As he could do these things, he was the kind of fix-it guy. He says the more he worked and grew her company, the less she worked. And the more she spent on travel, restaurants, gifts, the nanny, the housekeeper, etc. He says it became pathetic. He says how she would stay in bed until noon, remain on social media at night. All the time it was drama, drama, drama. The nanny took care of the house and their children. The business, after he fixed it, was bringing in $75,000 per month. It was about $10,000 per month when she was in charge of it. And at the time, he said his wife was only averaging about 3 days of work per month. Obviously, I addressed the situation with her several times, he said, and then she falsely accused him of being an abusive SOB For the record, he explains, he was also very kind and supportive of her and her family, never abusive at all in any fashion. And in hindsight, she was actually very abusive to him, verbally, psychologically, and physically. But he says, just like many other men who tolerate these situations, I am a real man, he says. I can take it. She's not like this, he thought. Blah, blah, blah. So goes the false belief. His wife then cuts him out of the business that he helped her successfully grow. She takes over where he left off, claims a monkey can do whatever he did. Soon after this, she files a police report falsely accusing him of abusing her older daughter. Police and CPS get involved. Now, due to the seriousness of the allegations, he is forced to move out. It takes a year before he can see his daughter again. Court, police, and CFS are satisfied the allegations are false. He is then allowed access. Now, another false allegation is made, and another, and another, and another, he says. CFS and police investigators ensue, and they found it's all false. As they opened up his home, he let them in. He let them in his life. He put his life on the table, and they found that these were lies. He let them come in his house unannounced. He says, I drove the investigation forward. They start looking at her now, her emotional abuse of the kids. He says, I think what helped me a lot was when they asked me to take a lie detector test, and I agreed to go on a condition that she had to take one as well. She refused, and they never asked again. Suddenly, she wants to talk about getting back together. I've been hearing that her business has suffered horribly since she took over, and she's been blacklisted from many customers. It failed. And she'd like to work for me. To which he replied, no. Now, allegations continue, all false, and CFS realizes it. CFS seizes the kids from her. Now my daughter are with me full time, he says. His ex-wife, who started this descent to destruction, cannot see her daughter without CFS supervision. Court-imposed psychiatric assessment reveals that she has a nasty psychological disorder and must get years of treatment. Now, our last story this afternoon comes to us from a man who feels lucky that he avoided false rape allegations and that this should send a message to all men. He is Michael A. Gregorium, and he writes, while thankfully my story has a good ending, it contributed to pushing me into a 5-year depression that I'm just starting to get out of. This happened back in 2012 to 2013. Our last story this afternoon comes to us from a man who feels lucky enough that he avoided false rape allegations and that this should send a message to all men. He is Michael A. Gregorium, and he writes, while thankfully my story has a good ending, it contributed to pushing me into a 5-year depression that I'm just starting to get out of right now. He said this happened back in 2012-2013 timeframe. I was in a friends with benefits situation with a girl named Haley. We had hooked up a couple of dozen times or so before. I had to move from North Carolina to South Dakota. He said we stayed in contact, and whenever I was able to make my way to North Carolina to see family or friends, I stopped by and hook up with her. On the second year after the move, during a visit for Christmas, we meet up as usual and ended up hanging out at her friend's apartment. And during that time, they had drinks. We were all over each other for the better part of 2 hours before finally we left the apartment and had sex in her car. Now, everything was fine, he said, when we eventually all parted ways. I woke up the next morning to a phone call from her. She proceeds to tell me that she has a boyfriend, which in itself is odd considering the basis of our relationship was that she didn't want a boyfriend. Friends with benefits followed up by saying and telling him that she was positive she told him about the previous night, which I'm sure she did not, and then leapt to the conclusion that because she thought she told him and because I didn't just outright leave her alone, that I must have raped her. At first he said I was just kind of shocked that she would even say that to me. Jen just got mad. I yelled at her, questioning how she could even come up with something like that. The good part in all of this is that nearly as soon as I stood my ground, she backed down and apologized to me. I hung up the phone and sat in silence for a few minutes before I just broke down. My mom eventually heard me and came to check on me, but she couldn't really do much to console me at the time. Just for some reference, I've had a girlfriend break up with me because I am very passive about sex until either she make a move first or I get to know them better. He says with Haley, it was a case of the former. Not every time, obviously, but on the night in question, she gave him oral sex to help me get it up. But he says he was nervous about doing it in the open air in her car. He says, I heard the horror stories of guys who get accused, convicted of rape. To think I was one misstep away from the police being called was terrifying. It's 2021 now, and I haven't been with anyone else since. And I would caution any guy in this situation to be safe. Okay? So we come back once a month with this program. If you have any stories where you were falsely convicted, falsely accused, let us know. For MNN, this is Charles Rivers. Thank you very much.